guy is this guy? Wait.
Okay, hi guys. My name is Mikkel. We're going to do some live hacking, and I think I might have every single demo god against me because we've been working very hard internally trying to not make this happen, okay? So it's going to be super awesome, maybe. It's also maybe going to be an epic fail, but that's how life is as a hacker, right? Something you used last week doesn't necessarily work the next week. And that is what we're going to try out here. So first off, my name is Mikkel. I'm a cybersecurity expert here in Truesec. I have a background in software engineering. I mostly did machine learning and cryptanalysis at my university. But I pretty soon understood that I needed to go full scale into cybersecurity. So I've been working with Truesec for almost a year now. I've been working previously as a red teamer in other companies, but now it's Truesec. And that's short for me because we have limited time. The last time, 2 weeks ago, when I did this presentation, it was 1 hour and 50 minutes. So we need to speed up a bit, right? And quickly, just for the disclaimer part here, right? So we don't hack to destroy. That's not our job. We hack to prevent. So we do that so an organization unfamiliar with cybersecurity can figure out what are our vulnerabilities, how crazy are they, what can they do to our company, and the best way is actually just to show them, right? There's nothing like pulling the domain controller in front of the entire IT department, and then we can high fives and try to figure out how to make it better, right? So that's me, that's why we do it, and also because it's super fun. I'm going to be targeting the Microsoft platform in this presentation. It's a bit arbitrary. It's a strong solution. It's a solution that we attack a lot because it's heavily used in the market. The vulnerabilities that we're doing, or the evasion techniques that we're doing here, are not specific to Microsoft. Microsoft is an excellent product. So that is what I'm going to say for disclaimers, right? So I am not here to showcase 0 days for you guys. We have one available, but we need to disclose that in the correct manner. It was found last week, so we haven't had time to do the responsible disclosure yet. So maybe next year we can do some 0 days instead. But this presentation is basically just based on the forced links that you have here, right? So just soldered together in a Mikkel kind of way, okay? Quickly jumping ahead. So what are we going to do? So the Microsoft environment that we're attacking is typically, you know, and very high levelly, you can split it up in the following boxes here. So what we have is the user land. That's where you are when you come in and interact with Microsoft Windows. You reside inside the user land, and you can, whatever applications you spawn, they will be here. So this is our natural place, right? Then we have the kernel land. That's where we want to be, right? We want control of the kernel, because once we have control of the kernel, we have almighty powers. So this is where we want to go. And how do you get there? Well, you do that through the native API. And the native API is just a set of DLLs that you probably all know. We got the kernel 32, the kernel base, and the NT-DLL. Those specific DLLs is the one that I target in this evasion technique. So that's why I'm mentioning. So the issue here is because on the far other side, we have the EDR, right? And that's the guy we don't want to talk to. We absolutely don't want to do any sort of dancing with that one, except maybe killing it. But how do we do that? That's what we're going to see, right? So the typical flow, when you launch something in the user land space, like the app we're going to launch in a minute, right? You will go through the native API down to the kernel. You need access to a memory space. You need to allocate resources, right? That goes via the native API. However, that will be patched by the EDR. That's how many EDRs work, right? So they will make sure that before you can enter the kernel, you would have to go through the man we don't want to meet. And he will evaluate, or she in these days, will evaluate whether or not we're allowed to go down there. And we don't want that, because that's where we will be caught, right? So how can we achieve that? Essentially in 2 ways. We're going to do 2 ways. I'm only going to show you one due to time, but we leverage them both in order to make the other one more disguised. The first one is the green one over here. So one might say, why should I use the native API when I can just create my own gateway down there, right? And it's maybe not as simple. It requires basic knowledge of assembly code, also how to retrieve the actual syscalls that you want to allocate on the kernel base. These will be different from every time you attack, right? So every single machine on different patch levels might have different syscalls, right? So you need to be able to find those before you can create your own gateway. I will show you how. The other one is simply by using the native API, right? Just not using the EDR. And the way we can do that is, so when I spawn a process, I get the native APIs on board. They're all in my process space, my good friends that I can play with, but I don't want to play with them because they will cheat on me and tell the EDR. So we want to, make sure that whatever requests they're doing to the EDR, that will be jump statements in many cases, are removed. And that is what we want to try, right? That is all I had from the presentation here, right? Great. Let's see if we can find some code somewhere. This is, by the way, the target machine. It's running Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, in case you wondered. So this is the code. Is it fairly visible, or should we zoom in a bit? Okay now? Great. So we're not going to go deep diving. As I said, that will take a very, very long time. But essentially, we spawn our process, right? The process is now spawned. I collect my process ID. We use that for a later stage. But then we proceed. And we talked about now we need to remove all the interactions between the native API and the EDR. And we can do that, for instance, the first technique here, by whitelisting the interaction, right? And how can we do that? So it turns out that if I, from my process, spawns a new process, that is what's going on here, right? So we will spawn the con host. And we retrieve the handles of that one, but we spawned it in suspended state. We didn't start it actually, right? And what turns out is that the EDR will not do anything to hook the comrades of our suspended state executable, right? So now we can actually have a child process with unhooked binaries in them, right? That's really, really nice because we want those binaries so badly, right? What we're then doing is we're going to jump a bit ahead here. We're basically opening the file. We're going to find the text section of that file. The text section is where actually all of the good stuff is. This is where how the binary works is. We can access our child process because we own it. So we don't need to manipulate memory in order to do so. So we just access our child process and we request the text section. We'll do some tricks in order to find the text section because that will vary from time to time. But one way of doing it is loading a fresh one from disk and figuring out where is the text section offset and then use that to collect the data from our child process, okay? Once we have that, well, it becomes quite simple, right? Because all the good comrades in my process that we are attacking are also my memory space, so I can do with it whatever I like. So I just take the entire text section from the DLLs that we want, copy them over into my own space, right? And now all the hooks deployed by the endpoint is gone. Now we can only do this for the native DLL, like NT-DLL. All the other DLLs that we wanted to unhook are not there yet because it's only suspended. So, but now we got all the NT-allocate virtual memory, NT-protect virtual memory, all of these APIs are now fully unhooked, right? So we can use them to get the other binaries into our memory space as well. And it follows more or less the same approach. So we will not get them from our child process. We cannot because he doesn't have them. But we can get them from the disk. And then the memory space we can now unprotect so we can read it. We can do that stealthy because we now have the native API unhooked, right? We took that in, and then we just do the same thing right over our own text space and our own memory process. And now you have the kernel base and the kernel 32 and the NT-DLL perfectly unhooked for your memory space, right? So that is essentially what is going on all the way down here. So first we remove NTDLL, we remove kernel base, and then we remove kernel 32, right? Now, at this stage, we don't need our child process anymore, so we might as well just kill it, and we will. So we don't need to have stuff lying around, right? So we kill it. We could introduce some events, Windows event kills here as well, out of scope for this presentation, because then we will use in an extra hour, right? But basically now we're free. We can retrieve our payload. The payload that I retrieve is just encrypted payload. Get it from online or from some other place of your choice. But retrieve the payload, we decrypt it, and now we actually have in our buffer, so in our working memory space, we have the Cobalt Strike beacon there, right? Just ready to be put in. And now we can actually, so I'm going to show you here. So if we go up to the payload injector here, right? Now we can just use all our default function calls down to kernel, because none of them are hooked anymore. So we can manipulate with them as we like without being thrown at the EDR, right? We don't want to talk to him. So what we have achieved now is actually great conversation possibilities with the native kernel land, right? Which is nice. We didn't kill the EDR, right? It's still there. So from a defensive perspective, when we go into the security platform, our machine will still be fully alive and pinging back results, just not the ones that we're creating, right? It's not that black and white. There will come some in because the EDR can measure other stuff as well. So we, for instance, need to... Great time to get a call, huh? So we can, for instance, if we just call directly out to a Cobalt Strike C2 server out there, obviously we'll be caught again because that is so heavily fingerprinted. So we need to bypass that as well. I'm only going to tell you how we do it. So essentially, we have a proxy running as a Azure function. It can be whatever. I just chose Azure functions because companies tend to not proxy those on Microsoft, on Azure endpoints through their proxy, which makes it possible for us to not be seen there as well. So it's an Azure thing. If we navigate it, it will just scrape information from a newspaper and throw it out in a JSON format. So if you were to investigate, of course we can, if we're targeting a oil company or something else, we can make it relevant, look like something that would make sense to be shown inside that company, right? If people have public APIs, to scrape that one and throw their own data right at them, right? So once the threat hunter goes in and tries to figure out requesting this API, he will just see some news relevant to somebody in the company, right? And we will have a lot of placeholders there to say, like, is this a valid beacon ping that goes in? Does it have the right authorization to talk? And only in the case that those fingerprint matches, we will be forwarded to the... It's always nice, right? Just as we are about to deploy something. No, I have enough power. I am almost full. Is it online again? Great. So once the beacon calls in, it will have the correct set of parameters there so that the proxy knows, okay, this is allowed to go through, and it will let it through and it just send the results back. And the result that we're receiving here will just be what we just discussed, the news feed from whatever vendor you would like, right? Except now all the ID fields of that JSON object has now been removed and has we inserted the beacon data, right? So now we're just taking that, assembling, executing, right? That's essentially it, and I think that's as fast as I can do it. There's a lot of neat tricks down here that you would need to study and identify if you want to do it yourself. So let's try to deploy it. And before we did this presentation, we have been working with the SOC and with Microsoft, so our own SOC and Microsoft, in order to figure out ways to kill this technique. And that has been going well. This malware that I've created have been living for 1.5 years now. We've been using it on and executed on engagements, right? And everything's fine. It'd been burned once, right? And I had to do some modification and everything was fine. Then Truesec Sock comes around and it does some purple team with me and it get burned 7 times in a week. So that gave me a bit of a pressure because one of the times was last night. So now Microsoft is starting to picking up on this, and that's really why everyone should really invest in getting an EDR, because if somebody is detected over here at a company X, then once we go to company Y that has not been infected yet, they will get the same rules, right? And even if they had been infected, right, everything will just be cleared and thrown away. So if we compile it, we get this binary here. And we can try to flow it over here. And let's see if, if we get burned. At least it can be on disk now. That's great. And let's try to execute. OK, opening the gateway. That's what I want to see. And I am just going to find, yeah, here it is. So perfectly compromising a fully monitored environment, running the Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. Let me just stress, it could be any. We just attack the best. So obviously, Microsoft is a big player out there, and I'm up against Microsoft almost every week, new client, new Microsoft installation. So that's kind of becoming my specialty. So nothing against the solution. That solution is great, okay? And I have 2 minutes left. Should I spend them on something nice, or should we go to questions?
I mean, you can spend it on things that's nice, but this is interesting, right? I still want to, let's have a conversation here, because this is, you're getting foothold here.
Yeah.
Somebody runs your malware, and you're bypassing the EDR. SOC is blind right now. What's next?
Okay, so what's next can depend on the maturity of the company that we're obviously attacking, right? So obviously, once I get this foothold into a client's machine, it would be some random PC that we got from some phishing attack, right? So I don't own the entire network yet. I don't own all the computers. I just have this one laptop, right?
Yeah.
So my next steps will be to, now we were administrators immediately here. That's not typically the case. But my first steps would probably be to try to take full control over this machine, right? So getting administrative privileges over that. And then I would start to move around in the company, to do lateral movement and continue my engagement, right? And that will, of course, perhaps, depending again on the level of detection, leave a footprint after me, right? For all the detection people to pick up on. So even though the foothold is unknown, yeah, say I jump to another server, somehow they are monitoring, for instance, passing hashes over SMB or something like that, we will get some, breadcrumbs that, okay, this machine just, accessed this server out there, and it's never done that before. That's odd. It might not be a critical. It might not even be a medium. Some other people can answer that better than me. But it will probably be an event. And that event can be found. And then you can pipe it all the way back, trace through the logs. And you will be able to see that some tool called, in this case, Summit, had been executed. And we don't know that tool. And apparently, we don't get events from it anymore. Pretty suspicious, and then you're capable of killing it, right?
Yeah, and then Niklas Kaiser will take your thing and reverse it and find your shit. So
yeah. So as I said, what has really been going on the last 3 weeks is that we had a environment monitored by our own SOC here in Truesec, yeah, where we deployed this tool. And initially, I didn't do much. It was just there. We have execution. Can you find it? That in itself weren't enough to get it enough so that we could report on it, because a lot of native, maybe not native, but a lot of normal application have somewhat the same capabilities. So for instance,
you're not really touching disk either, right?
This can be done without touching disk. This can be done from PowerShell or anything else. VBA might touch disk via a Word document or something like that. Mm-hmm. It can be done without touching disk. Then you have another, something to pick up on, right? Why is this thing executing without having something physical, right? So there are many layers when it comes to attacking, right? If this was a ransomware threat actor, we would probably see some pretty noisy stuff quite fast, because they are, businessmen. They need to infect and destroy as many computers as soon as possible, right? And those will definitely be caught, right? They're out of the game immediately if you have surveillance, right? But when it comes to more, resource capable adversaries like nation-state threat actors, well, they might not go around running Mimikatz directly once gaining the foothold, right? They'll probably investigate more low-key and live off the land and try to figure out what is actually here that I can take advantage of. Like, for instance, passwords on shares. We see that all the time. Just browsing the shares, pretty tough to pick up on. If there is a password here to your domain admin, which is often the case.
Yeah. Domain misconfigurations.
Exactly, that's where I'm getting. We have so many layers like network segmentation and endpoint hardening, et cetera, right?
But in theory, let's say that you're sitting on this box here and you're finding, you're not doing that much communication, but you find another server that's not protected.
Okay, so that is what we would typically do if this was a exercise where we don't want to get caught, right? So we try to enumerate what is out there, typical shares. Do I have right access to a share? If so, is it a large share? If it's a large share, there's a very high likelihood that this share is been excluded from the defender, and then we can do all our noisy stuff from there, right? It can also be a surveillance camera, I will add. We've done that as well. So finding a regular surveillance camera, you can authenticate to it with admin, because that was never really looked at. And you get in there and you can deploy all your stuff there and hack the company from the camera, right? So we really have a lot of different layers here. So protecting your endpoints with an endpoint detect and response is a super good thing, probably also the fastest and the best thing that you can do for your cybersecurity maturity. But there are other things that you need to think about as well.
Yeah, and primarily when we do attacks like this, when we are going into system and doing an audit, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for misconfigurations where sysadmins forgot about it, or things that have been legacy, or just didn't truly understand all the way through. So even though you're able, in this case, to prove on stage that you can bypass Microsoft EDR, that's something that next week there's going to be a new way to do it, and then there's going to be another way. So having a SOC or something that adds customers' rules and monitoring everything, it's crucial. Definitely. In that way, if you want to detect stuff.
Definitely. And one of the misconfigurations that we're seeing a lot right now, especially in Denmark, where I'm from, is misconfiguration of the SCCM or MDT deployment tools, right? So what we typically see is that if the SCCM, so the tool that you use to essentially boot up a new PC and get the stuff on it and get it domain joined, typically that one has domain administrative credentials, right? And if that credentials are not guarded, because they must be accessible at some point in time, we can retrieve them quite easily. And what we're also seeing is that, maybe it's not a domain administrator, but it must own this object while it enrolls it, which means that you must remove those privileges once it is enrolled, because if you have extended rights, which is the right you will have in this scenario, you can just request any machine to give me their LAPS or AD password, right? So then everything will start going really fast.
Yeah, unless you have a one-way ticket where you can only write the machine object to the AD, or there's ways around to harden that, of course. We're open for questions before Sebastian gets on. Anyone have any questions to this hacker? Anyone? Scream loud. I got all the questions. What's your next project? Hey, don't hit the player. Drop 0 days.
Right now we have the 0 day, but we're not really going to use it because that is not really the idea that we should run around being cowboys ourselves. We have our professional reputation, and we actually do care, right? What if somebody forgot that thing at some client and somebody else find it you know the drill. So no, that is not. I do a lot of vulnerability.
Are you
research.
adulting now?
Yes.
You seem very grown up, right? You know, responsible disclosure. Using.
But we have another thing coming up, which is an automated attack tool, essentially.
Yeah.
So I have, as I said, a background in machine learning and that domain, and I think combining those two into a automated thing could be very, very, very fun. Perhaps also a bit dangerous, but you know, with great danger comes great fun, right?
Yep.
Isn't that the saying? So
no risk, no gain. I love it. Awesome, Mikkel. Thank you very much. Mikkel. Sebastian is getting on stage in a few minutes, and he's going to talk about some really cool stuff. And that's more development hacking for you. So it's last